Hello, my name is Mr. Curtis, and this is Bruce. Today, Bruce has a paintbrush, and that's because today we're doing some watercolor painting, and specifically we'll be painting some character illustrations. So today we're going to be inventing our own characters and then coloring them in using some watercolor techniques. And these techniques you can use for illustration like I'll show you, but you can also use them for landscape painting or any other kind of paintings you want to do. So let's get started. Hey Bruce, I'm going to help you down, and Bruce is going to go off to his painting station and we're going to get started. Okay, before we get into the watercolor painting, we need to design a character. So I've been thinking a lot about character illustration and just illustration in general because I have been making some pictures like this. I've been working on a book, and this is a story that's told with no words. So the story is only told through pictures, so kind of like a graphic novel. So I've been making a lot of pictures and drawing and redrawing these characters over and over again, and so it's something I've been having a lot of fun with, and I thought I would share that with you. And I've been using a bit of watercolor to add color to some of these images as well. There's a lot of pencil work here and a lot of pencil crayon and watercolor pencil as well. Today what we're going to do is we're going to be using watercolor paint, which is another great way of adding color to anything, but illustration work too. So first of all, we have to invent a character. Why am I showing you this character right here? This one you might remember from last week's drawing games. This was the mixed up animal game, and this is the character that I invented. So if you're having a hard time thinking of a character and you did the mixed up animal game, you could use that for inspiration. That's what I did, and I'm going to show you what I turned this into in a minute. But when it comes to character design, not only are we going to be designing a character, but we're going to be illustrating that character. So that means I don't want you to just draw a character standing still. I want you to illustrate that character. So that means that implies a story. So you want that character to be standing in a certain way or doing something which tells us a little bit something about them. So this reminded me a little bit of a dragon, the way that I drew it with the lizard body here, and the horse's head really looks dragon-like. So I thought, oh, dragons. Well, let's draw a dragon. So then I started drawing a dragon here, sketching it out with the head, and made it look a little more realistic. And then drew the front leg here, and I thought, well, it's looking okay, but it doesn't really tell me anything about who that character is. So I decided to draw that dragon in a little different way. So I ended up drawing kind of a dragon head, but more of a humanoid body, and he's sort of sitting in this king's throne. And I thought, well, that's a little more interesting. He's doing something. He looks bored. I like that idea of a bored dragon, and it makes you wonder why he's bored. But I wasn't really happy with how this was turning out. So then I thought, well, I can make him a little bigger, make the chair a bit smaller. So I started working on that. And so you can see a lot of eraser lines here because it wasn't quite turning out the way I wanted to. I didn't really like the position of the body in this drawing, so then I kind of gave up on that, and then I started drawing again, and this was my final result. So here's my big dragon, and he's sitting in this tiny little throne because, I mean, dragons are big, right? And then he's got this little tiny king's crown, or queen's crown, I suppose, on top of his or hers head. I'm not sure the gender of the dragon. And it makes you wonder, what's the story here? Did the dragon eat the king or queen, and now he's bored because he's eaten everybody in the kingdom? So there's a story that's implied here. So I really like how that turned out. So what I did is I just drew this as a sketch on a piece of regular paper here, just printer paper. So I took this and I took my watercolor paper. So that's what you'll need to do. feel free to sketch out your ideas as many times as you want, and then get your watercolor paper, and you'll need to draw this onto your watercolor paper. And how I transferred it is, all I did is I took my sketch and my watercolor paper to a bright window, just a window with the sun shining brightly through it, and then I put this underneath and I just copied it like that. So I copied it onto the watercolor paper. So you put your sketch underneath, and then you put this against the window here, and you'll be able to see that drawing shine through, and then you can transfer that image onto the watercolor paper. You'll need your image on the watercolor paper so that you'll be able to paint it with watercolor, because watercolor will not behave very well on just a regular piece of paper, and that's why you've got watercolor paper. Okay, a couple of other things I want to mention about your character design before we get into the painting. As far as the style goes, your style is your style, so it can look however you want that character to look. Some characters are very, very simple. So if you think of some very popular characters like SpongeBob SquarePants, for example, he's very, very simple. He's just a square, basically with eyes, nose, and mouth and pants, and he's a very compelling character. So you can go cartoony if you want. It doesn't matter what. You can go anime if you want. It doesn't matter what your style is, but what I'm looking for is more. My challenge to you is to make it, give it a story, give it life, give it personality by what it's doing in your image. Okay, so now let's get to the coloring and the painting part. All right, so we've got ourselves a flat surface, so any table will do. Make sure that you're working on a flat surface so that your paint doesn't run, and get yourself some masking tape. Any kind of masking tape is fine. You don't need the green stuff, and just tape down all edges of your watercolor paper to your flat surface. Okay, before we get any further, let's talk some more about supplies. I already mentioned the masking tape. You're going to need some water. You're going to need your watercolor paint set. Mine has 10 colors, but really all you need are the primary colors, so red, yellow, and blue, as well as black and white, and then you'll be able to mix any color that you want. Now, you'll notice that I don't have white, and many watercolor sets don't come with white, and that's because you can use the white of your paper as the white in your mixture. So when you're mixing your colors, just make them very thin, and then allow that white of the paper to shine through and include the white in your mixture. You'll need some paper towel or a rag to wipe your brush with and clean your brush with. You're going to need some watercolor paper, and I like to have a spare piece of watercolor paper handy so that I can test out my colors on that piece of paper before I commit to painting onto my actual illustration. As for brush, I'm using a number 6 or 8, I think, watercolor brush. It's just a round, sharp pointed watercolor brush. I like the tip because then you're able to get into those hard to reach areas, but some people like to use the flat brushes. It's a preference, so you can use what you've got. Let's start painting. So what I'm doing here is I am wetting the paper all around the area where I want the background color to be, because I'm going to be making a wash, and if you wet your watercolor paper first before you put your color down, it'll just help give an even spread. So I've got my blue here, and I made the blue just a little bit too rich, a little bit too much paint in my mix. I think I should have had a little more water in there to make it a wash. But generally what should happen is if you've wetted the area around your drawing, the watercolor, the paint should stay where the wet areas are, and you shouldn't have too much bleed. There's lots of different ways of coloring in your background with watercolor. It's a good idea to do a wash. One way to do it is by taking a larger brush and covering your entire image with your wash, and then letting that dry, and then painting the color of your illustration over top of the wash. The problem with that is that you'll always have that color of the wash as your base color, And so, for example, if I'm using blue, then that blue is going to be the undertone of everything else that I paint in my illustration. So if I want to use any of the white of the paper for my illustration, then I want to keep my image white. You can experiment with this, of course, and there's lots of different ways of painting, and the best way to learn what works for you is just by trying lots of different ways of doing things. So this is one way of doing it, and you're welcome to try another way. I've let the background dry here before I decided to go with my next color. And that's just so that when I get to the edges of my dragon, there won't be bleed into the blue of my background, creating a green splotch. So I just let the background dry. So now I've got a yellow here, and I'm just going back and forth with the water to make sure that I've got a good mixture. I don't want it to be, you want to make sure that you've got it nice and loose so that it dries very evenly. My dragon's not going to be yellow. I want my dragon to be green, but I start with yellow because watercolor is a light to dark medium. You want to start with your lightest colors first, and then you're going to build on top of those colors to create depth and shadows and things like that. So because I wanted green, I'm starting with yellow, because yellow and blue make green. My thinking here was that I'll start with yellow, and then if I do a light wash with blue, that might create an interesting green. So I've tried it here on the paper, on my test paper, and I decided I didn't quite like that look. So then I'm just going with the green that's with my watercolor set. In watercolor, when you're painting one color on top of another, there's two different ways of doing it. You can paint wet on wet, which I've heard called charging. So the charging is you're painting one color on top of another, so you're charging one color with another one. And then there's also painting wet on dry, and that's called glazing. So I'm using both of those techniques here. I'm painting the green on top of the yellow, and that green is going on top of the yellow, which is already wet. So I'm charging the yellow with the green, and you can see how they're kind of blending and mixing. And with that style, you get the edges are very soft and they blend together very well. And later on, I'm going to be doing some glazing, where I'm going to let everything dry, and then I'll go back in with another color, and that color will sit on top and will blend differently when you do wet on dry, and that's called glazing. Something that I'm doing with my brush here is that I'm going back and forth from the painting to the paper towel, which is a little bit out of frame, so it's a little hard to see. But what I'm doing is that if I notice that the mixture that I have is too wet on the paint that I've applied to my image, what I can do is I can wipe my brush and then take that brush and then soak up some of that watercolor from my image, and then I can use it kind of as a sponge to take up some of that extra paint that's on the paper, and then bring it back to my paper towel, wipe it again, and then bring it back until I've got the consistency that I want, so that I can spread it and get the effect that I want. So a brush can be used in different ways. It's not just for spreading the paint, but you can also use it to remove paint sometimes as well, like a sponge. So what I'm doing here is layering the paint. I started with wet on wet, so I charged the yellow with the green, and then as I'm painting the dragon, some of that green will dry slightly, and then I'm going over top of that with more green, and that's going to darken the green in certain areas that I want shadows. So after several layers of green, I've gone in and I've added some brown washes over top where I want areas to be even darker. And I've gone in and added some brown to the throne where I want it to look a little more gold, or added some variants to the yellow there to make it look a little more gold-like. You can play around with colors in watercolor, and when you're layering colors or you're mixing on your paper, you can try different color combinations and see what you get, see what you like. Here I'm using my extra piece of watercolor paper as a straight edge to try to define the ground a little better, where the dragon is sitting. and adding a layer of blue there to darken the ground a little bit. Now to finish things off, I'm using a dark pencil here to just help define the edge of my character and to color in some more shadows and to add some more darkness. And you can use ink to do this as well. You can use a black pencil crayon. You can use a regular pencil as well and see what kind of effects you can get. Feel free to experiment, see what materials you have at home, and don't be afraid to mix mediums. So medium is just a fancy word in art for materials. So you've got your watercolor paint, bring in some pencil crayons and add to it and see what you get. So it's all about experimenting, trying different things and seeing what works for you and what you like. There we go. That's a watercolor painting and a character illustration. I'm really curious to know what kind of characters you came up with and how you illustrated them. I'm also curious to know how Bruce did. What kind of character did he come up with? Let's have a look. Hey Bruce, how's your character? Wow, not what I was expecting, but a good example of character illustration. Let's have a look. Bruce's character is a paint can who's lost his paint with tragic results. Until next time, keep thinking creatively and be kind to yourself. Bruce.